This is the absolutely shocking story of 19-year-old Lizette Cuesta, and the circumstances in which she was found are just impossible to wrap your head around. At 3:15 in the morning, on a totally deserted highway, a group of workers noticed what they first thought was roadkill. But it was her. The girl was still conscious, but what had been done to her, around 30 stab wounds. This wasn't a robbery. This was pure inhuman rage. We're gonna break down step by step what led to this horrible night, and how this girl's incredible force of will became the key for the entire investigation. And you have to watch until the end, because that's where we'll try to figure out what could possibly cause this kind of savage, unexplainable cruelty. Hey everyone, my name is Dean. Let's not drag this out. Just tell me what city you're from, what time is it where you are, and what's the weather like. And tell me, do you have a weird but totally innocent habit? Okay, let's get into it. February 12th, 2018, Alameda County, California. This is the place where an absolutely horrific, extraordinary event took place. Picture the time, 3:15 a.m. This isn't just night. This is that specific hour when the world stops, when calls to 911 almost always mean disaster. And this call was no exception. The dispatcher heard a man's voice reporting a gruesome discovery, a severely injured young woman. And where? On a completely deserted stretch of the 2-lane Tesla Road, right at the foot of Livermore. This is not a place that's buzzing with life at 3 in the morning. The nighttime traffic there is basically zero. Who even ends up there at that time? How was she even found? Pure tragic chance. A group of workers was driving to their night shift in a nearby town. They were just doing their routine, driving down the dark road, when they noticed something strange, something totally out of place on the shoulder. Their first thought, maybe roadkill, a deer or a coyote, something that, unfortunately, happens a lot on dark roads like that. But then, they saw movement. It was this faint movement that made them stop and figure out what was going on. When they got closer, that initial alarm turned into real ice-cold horror. It wasn't an animal. It was a blood-covered human figure, barely alive. But, and this is the key, incredible moment, she was still conscious. Yeah, before we dive into the details of this shocking case, just for a second, make sure to hit subscribe on the channel. It's not just numbers. It really helps us spread these important stories to more people. And drop a comment where you're watching from and what time it is. We're always curious to see our audience's geography. Back to that dark road. The victim was on the very edge of losing consciousness, but she was desperately, with her last bit of strength, holding on to life. The condition they found her in, it's just unthinkable. Numerous cuts covered her entire body. There was so much blood that it had completely soaked her hair, so much so that the workers couldn't even tell its natural color. And here's where the situation gets even worse, if that's even possible. In this remote area, there was absolutely zero cell phone reception. Zero. Not a single bar. In 2018, this meant that every minute, every second of delay while they looked for help was literally eating away at her chances of survival. The workers had to make an instant decision. The rescue operation began immediately, but it was total improvisation. They split up. The driver had to do the only thing he could: leave the scene, leave his colleagues and this girl, and urgently race to the nearest spot where his phone would finally get a signal to call 911. Meanwhile, his coworker, a man named Richard, stayed with the injured woman. Just imagine being in his shoes, in the middle of the night, on a dark highway, with a person dying right in front of you. Richard understood how critical this was. He acted on instinct. He covered the girl with a blanket to try and stop the heat loss, and he started talking. He tried to keep up any kind of conversation with her, just to keep her from losing consciousness, constantly reassuring and encouraging her. He, essentially, understood that this stranger's life or death now depended only on him. Precious time was ticking by. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the girl's condition was clearly getting worse. Richard was literally, desperately fighting for her life, just by not letting her fall asleep, not letting her disconnect. He probably intuitively understood what paramedics know. If she fell asleep in that state, she might never wake up. Sleep could be fatal. This man, this random witness who was just driving to work, became her only thin thread, her only hope for survival in these absolutely critical minutes. When the medical team finally arrived on scene, they immediately assessed the situation. Their verdict was instant and harsh. Her injuries were completely incompatible with transport by a regular ambulance. Why? Because of the main injury, a deep, horrific cut to her throat. This required immediate evacuation and the fastest one possible. A helicopter became her only chance. If they had tried to take her in a ground ambulance on those roads, it would have most likely been fatal before she even got to the hospital. But despite all these emergency measures, despite the speed of the response and all the efforts of the medical staff, the victim of the attack died. She died shortly after being hospitalized. The medical examination later revealed the full scale of this brutality. She was found to have approximately 30 stab wounds, 30, and the vast majority of them were concentrated around her neck. This isn't a robbery. This isn't an accident. This was pure rage. But here's what's most stunning. Right before her death, in the last minutes of her life, the girl managed to do one crucial thing. She said her name. Her name was Lizette Cuesta. This incredible, extraordinary willpower, this persistent desire to survive, which this seemingly fragile girl showed, it all would later play an absolutely decisive role in the investigation. Her last words helped catch the killer. So who was this girl, Lizette Cuesta? When investigators started gathering her biographical data, they saw a portrait not just of a victim, but of a very active, vibrant, and driven person. She was a native of San Jose, California, had graduated high school just in 2016, and was already enrolled in college. She wasn't some lost soul. From a young age, Lizette loved skateboarding, led an active athletic lifestyle, had an attractive appearance, and, most importantly, a cheerful personality. Her professional ambitions, studying in college, combined perfectly with a busy social life. She found time for studying, for meeting friends, and for having fun. Everyone who knew her described Lizette as an incredibly energetic, sociable girl. She was one of those people, who positively influence those around them, who walk into a room and just seem to charge everyone around them with energy.
Just the most committed, loving, when she would show up to the park, everyone would be like, oh, it's Liz. Everyone would get in a good mood because her smile alone would brighten up a whole room.
Just how she would always laugh, and she was mainly really polite to everyone.
Well, just a few months before this tragic, fatal incident, Lizette and her father made a big step. They moved to the city of Tracy. This is about an hour's drive from their former home, the family nest in San Jose. This wasn't just changing apartments. It was a significant change of environment. And here's what's important. This change of residence, this move, was a conscious and fully thought out decision by Lizette herself. She, this active skateboarder, this social girl, was looking for a quieter living environment. Tracy instead of San Jose, which, by the way, is a pretty interesting detail. I mean, usually at her age, people are looking for the scene, looking for the epicenter of events. But she consciously chose something quieter. Maybe the chaos of the big city tired her out, or she just wanted a different pace of life. But this move in no way meant she was cutting ties. Not at all. She didn't run away from her family, like sometimes happens. On the contrary, she maintained very close relationships with all members of her large family. She regularly, for example, visited her mother's ranch, where she enjoyed horseback riding. This is just more proof of her active, vibrant lifestyle. And here we come to the most important part. Her father's testimony. He told investigators that he last saw his daughter alive, literally the day before this deadly attack. Not a week, not a month, the day before, during their last meeting, less than 24 hours before the disaster. He noticed absolutely no signs of alarm, no problems, no hint of fear in her eyes. Lizette remained herself, just as cheerful, positive, and outgoing as always. This is the classic and perhaps the scariest part of these stories. Nothing, absolutely nothing, foreshadowed the tragedy. And describing his daughter, her father especially emphasized those exact traits that she would so desperately show in the last minutes of her life. He said she was brave, determined, with enormous willpower and an incredible desire for independence.
Everybody knows how tough she was, how strong she was, She showed that at the end. Always.
And she really showed it in the end. on that dark road. She fought. Her father was right. It was those exact qualities, that strength, that determination, that in his opinion pushed Lizette to move to Tracy, looking for something better, trying to improve her living situation. She had a clear, adult plan for her life. She wasn't some flighty teenager living day to day. The plan was simple and totally logical. First, achieve financial stability, get firmly on her feet, and then think about starting her own family. Everything in order. And that's exactly why this brutal, savage attack wasn't just a tragedy for her father. It was a completely unpredictable, devastating blow. He just couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't imagine who could possibly want to inflict such hellish harm on such a bright, such a positive person. It seemed like she just didn't have any enemies or ill-wishers. He was absolutely convinced that Lizette, as she always did in her life, fought until the very end. But unfortunately, this time she just couldn't win. After they moved to Tracy, Lizette and her father didn't waste much time looking for housing. They acted fast, found a suitable apartment, rented it, and immediately settled in their new place. Her father, like a loving father should, fully supported his daughter in this quest for independence. And Lizette didn't just sit around. She immediately, very actively, started looking for a job. And soon, she found one. And right here, from this moment, the story starts to take on very dark, disturbing shades. She got a job at a private company, which was owned by 25-year-old Melissa Leonardo and her 19-year-old partner, Daniel Gross. And this 19-year-old Daniel Gross, her new employer, was also the father of Melissa's future child, Lizette. Suspecting nothing, began this new stage of her life, full of hopes and plans for a completely normal, happy future. At first, as it usually happens, the relationships at the new workplace remained purely professional. Work is work. But gradually, and as we understand, quite quickly, this situation began to change. The work relationship unexpectedly went beyond professional boundaries. Why? Because the young man, this 19-year-old boss, Daniel Gross, developed a romantic interest in his new employee, Lizette. Their communication became closer and closer, more and more personal, and this eventually led to the development of a full-blown romantic relationship between them. A relationship that, as we already know, would have absolutely fatal consequences for the girl. And this is where it gets hard to wrap your head around. The relationship between Lizette and Daniel developed despite the fact that the other business owner, Melissa, was expecting a child from Daniel during this exact same period. But that's not all. They weren't just expecting a child. The couple was engaged. And here is the most interesting and perhaps the strangest fact in this story. From the very beginning, Lizette was fully aware of all of this. She knew he was engaged and that his fiancée was pregnant. So what did Daniel do? It's just this 19-year-old guy even proposed a three-way relationship to his pregnant fiancée, Melissa. She, quite logically, initially refused, thinking that such an unconventional format, to put it mildly, wouldn't work for a couple about to become parents. But Daniel didn't give up. He dug his heels in. He wanted to build a relationship with Lizette. But at the same time, he had absolutely no intention of leaving his pregnant fiancée. He wanted to have it all. And what do you think? After long persuasion, Melissa agreed. She agreed to try. During this same period, to add even more complications to this already explosive picture, Daniel's mother was living with these young people. And of course, at some point, the woman found out about the relationship format her son was so desperately experimenting with. Her reaction was completely appropriate. She immediately expressed her extreme displeasure and asked Daniel to finally make a choice, explaining the obvious to him. Experiments like this never end well. It's just a powder keg. But he, a 19-year-old kid who apparently thought he'd caught God by the beard, was adamantly against it. He asked his mother not to interfere in their affairs, and the woman, unfortunately, didn't push it. Moreover, she met Lizette, and, by all accounts, they even became friends. The woman liked this new girl of her son's, and here's why this is so important. When the attack happened, it was Daniel's mother who immediately told the police that, in her personal opinion, Melissa, the pregnant fiancée, was guilty of this crime. Why did she decide that? Because, as it turned out, she already had negative feelings towards Melissa, towards Lizette's rival. According to Daniel's mother, something very alarming had happened. About a week before this brutal murder, she had heard with her own ears Melissa openly discussing how they could punish Lizette. This wasn't just jealousy anymore. These were direct threats. Melissa, from the very beginning, didn't approve of this love triangle, which is completely understandable. But Daniel had somehow strangely managed to convince her, or pressure her, of course. All of this caused just huge, colossal tension for the mother-to-be, for Melissa. And now, Daniel's mother went to the police with a heavy feeling of guilt. She was worried and believed, and she will probably beat herself up over this for the rest of her life, that if she had immediately reported those threats to law enforcement, it could have prevented Lizette's murder. But unfortunately, back then, a week ago, the woman just didn't suspect what it could lead to. I mean, who thinks about murder over jealousy? And despite the fact that Melissa was carrying her son's child, meaning her future grandchild, the woman sincerely felt it was her duty to share these suspicions about the pregnant fiancé. She openly admitted that from the very beginning, she didn't approve of Daniel's relationship with Melissa. She thought her son would be much better off with his new girl, with Lizette, and now she was sure. This toxic, weird love triangle simply got out of control and inevitably ended in this horrific bloodshed.
She was the mastermind of it. There was just all types of things that were said and done, and I didn't put two and two together. If I had, that girl would probably still be alive.
And when you say she, you're talking about Melissa.
Melissa.
Do you think she is?
Yes, I do. Because when Lisette started working there a couple months ago, I don't know how long, it was like two and a half months ago, she adored Daniel. And she didn't hide it or whatever. Everyone at her work knew that she liked Daniel, you know, and she couldn't help it. And he's just that type of person. He's a likable boy. And I know if it wasn't for her, he wouldn't have done it. She's just as guilty as he is. And I think she's the one that did it because of her jealousy. I wake up with nightmares thinking what that girl went through. And I can't believe my son had anything to do with it.
But while Daniel's mother was sharing her suspicions with the police, she was, basically breaking down an open door. Detectives by that time already knew the names of the guilty parties. Why? Because Lizette, as she was dying, fighting for every second, managed to tell them their names. Very little time had passed, only about 10 hours after Lizette was found on that cold, dark road. Meaning by 1:15 p.m., the police didn't just arrive. They showed up at Daniel's house. This was the same house where Melissa lived. And of course, the young man's mother, who was maybe still talking to detectives on the phone. And just think about the logistics of this cold-bloodedness. This place, their quiet house in Tracy, was located about 50 kilometers from that deserted road, meaning they drove her there, left her to die, and calmly returned home, driving 50 kilometers. Obviously thinking they had hidden everything, and it was all over. What happened next? Well, calling this arrest pretty dramatic is a very, very big understatement. It was a real movie. The house where the couple was, Daniel and Melissa, wasn't just surrounded, it was taken in a tight ring. A whole SWAT unit arrived on the scene. This wasn't two patrol officers sent to politely knock on the door. This was a full-scale operation to detain dangerous criminals. And here's a detail that shows the seriousness of the situation. One of the snipers, you will believe where he set up his position. He used a neighboring kid's treehouse as his observation post. Just imagine this surreal picture. A cute kid's fort, and inside it, a fully geared up soldier with a sniper rifle. Of course, the police weren't going to risk anyone's life. Neighbors from the two closest houses were immediately evacuated. Although they were evacuated to a safe distance, they still stayed nearby and of course became spectators of this incredible show unfolding on their quiet suburban street. And how did the suspects find out they were coming for them? They just saw it with their own eyes. All this preparation for the raid. All these people in heavy gear, weapons, vehicles. They noticed it right through the window. Daniel, along with his mother, who was still in the house, was of course incredibly alarmed by what was happening. Who wouldn't be? But as reported, everyone tried not to panic. Honestly, I wonder what they were thinking at that very moment. Then everything went by the protocol. Law enforcement, probably through a loudspeaker, ordered the young man's mother, the same one who called them with her suspicions, to immediately leave the house. She was a witness, not a suspect, and as soon as she was out and safe, they began the arrest itself, loudly demanding that the criminals, Daniel and Melissa, come out with their hands up and surrender. The neighbors who watched all this, the same ones who were evacuated, they were just shocked. This is, of course, expected. As it turned out, at that point, these young people had lived in this house for about 3 years, but they were, as the neighbors say, completely unsociable. You know, the hello goodbye type and nothing more. So basically, no one in the area knew anything about them. Quiet, unremarkable, right up until the day SWAT showed up on their lawn.
Well, I don't know who they were. I don't know them by names. I would always see like different people coming in and out from the house, so I know it's probably something suspicious going on out there.
They said, get out with the hands up, and we know that you're there.
A lot of people were surrounding this house a lot, and there's a lot of cops surrounding that house. Like they're making like a little circle, and we were right over there hiding.
Well, of course, an arrest involving an SWAT team, snipers in kids' treehouses, it inevitably kicked up a huge wave of different rumors in the neighborhood. Neighbors who knew nothing before suddenly started trying to remember anything, but honestly, everything they could tell the police was meager. They remembered that the guy Daniel had gone to the local high school, but never finished, and his girlfriend, Melissa, supposedly went to a different school nearby and even got a diploma, and that was it. Information over, not exactly helpful. Of course, when people see that level of a police operation, the first thought is drugs. A few people assumed just that this arrest might be related to illegal substances. Why? Because the young couple constantly had different friends coming over. Sometimes completely new, unknown faces would show up, and that constant flow inevitably attracted attention in a quiet suburb. They put 2 and 2 together and figured the couple might be dealing. It seemed like a logical explanation for an SWAT operation. But no, during the investigation, nothing like that was found. This wasn't about drugs. And here's the detail that just kills you with its mundanity. When the suspects finally came out with their hands up, Melissa, the pregnant fiancée, was still in her pajamas. They were caught completely off guard. They were apparently just relaxing after a job well done. Just imagine that dissonance. They committed this bloody massacre, left a girl to die 50 kilometers away, and just went home to sleep. After that, the police were finally able to talk to this couple. Talk, of course, is putting it strongly. Unfortunately for the investigation, the young people, Daniel and Melissa, were extremely reluctant to cooperate. They shut down, but eventually, with great difficulty, detectives managed to get the young man Daniel to talk. And this is where it gets weird. He confessed to the crime pretty quickly. Sounds like that's it, right? But no, he confessed, but with huge, just massive reservations. He started telling his version. All right, so let's hear Daniel Gross's version. According to him, on that fatal night, Lizette got into the car completely voluntarily, where he already was with his pregnant fiancée, Melissa. They were just driving around, and along the way, of course, they were smoking marijuana and drinking. Melissa, pregnant Melissa, was driving, and her 19-year-old fiancé Daniel was in the back seat with Lizette, and this, let's call it, pleasant evening, supposedly smoothly turned into intimacy right there in the back seat. According to the young man, this was totally normal. Why? Because, as it turns out, they were all in a polyamorous relationship, so he considered everything that was happening to be absolutely the norm. And the pregnant Melissa was at the wheel the entire time, just driving. It gets worse. According to Daniel, at some point he tied Lizette up with a yellow rope. But no, it's not what you're thinking. This was, quote, their role play, and it all happened exclusively with mutual consent, or so he claimed. Then, according to him, there was sex. But what happened next? The young man suddenly started describing very, very vaguely. The details just vanished. According to his version, they turned onto that same remote 2-lane road to Whirl Hollow, where the barely living victim was later found. And right here, on this dark road. Lizette, the same Lizette who, according to him, was tied up with a yellow rope for role play, suddenly and unexpectedly became aggressive and attacked him. The tied-up girl attacked. He says that after that, everything was like a fog, but he clearly remembered how scared he got, and so, of course, he was forced to defend himself. The situation, he said, instantly got out of control. Where did the weapon come from? Oh, Daniel explained that too. He knew that Lizette had a knife, and he was terrified that this tied-up girl would somehow miraculously get that knife and use it. The irony, this knife, he claimed, he himself had given to Lizette at the beginning of their polyamorous relationship, for self-defense, so she would feel safe when she was skateboarding in the evenings. And now this young man, this benefactor, claimed he couldn't let Lizette use that same knife to attack him. And so, he started acting preventatively. Detectives, of course, latched onto that. What exactly provoked you? Daniel dodged a direct answer for a long time, because there was one small problem with his self-defense story. The young man didn't have a single wound, at all. Not a scratch, nothing you'd get during such an active struggle. It seemed like Daniel didn't resist at all. Or more logically, no one was resisting him. This part of his testimony started changing right before their eyes, repeatedly. Finally, realizing the story about a tied-up girl with a knife sounded absurd, Daniel abandoned it. He came up with a new version. Now it turned out Lizette provoked the aggression by starting to hit him with her elbow in the ribs while she was tied up. And this elbow strike so enraged the young man that they started fighting. And then suddenly, it turned out that he had a knife, and that knife very quickly came in handy. And what about Melissa, the pregnant fiancée at the wheel? According to Daniel, she remained completely calm the entire time, as if nothing unusual was happening behind her. In the back seat, of course, all this nonsense about self-defense seemed absolutely implausible, just a wild explanation, especially against the backdrop of Lizette having around 30 stab wounds. And these weren't scratches, these were deep wounds, including a completely slashed throat. This isn't self-defense, this is a slaughter. But Daniel stubbornly insisted his pregnant beloved Melissa was at the wheel the whole time and took no part in the attack. He was completely covering for her. He claimed that after Lizette was cut, what a mild word he chose, he allegedly stopped and realized with horror what had happened. And what did this couple decide to do upon realizing this horror? Call 911? No. They decided that having a baby while under investigation was a bad idea. Brilliant. So they just left her body on the side of the dark road and drove off. They were absolutely certain the girl was dead. This all happened in February in California, and although it's generally a warm region, it was cold at night. They were clearly counting on the fact that even if the victim miraculously survived 30 stab wounds, she definitely wouldn't survive that cold night. They left her for dead, but they underestimated her. They underestimated that same willpower her father talked about. At the spot where the workers found Lizette, police also discovered a long, drawn-out bloody trail. It was horrific. Despite 30 stab wounds, despite a slashed throat, this girl had crawled. She crawled about 100 meters along the shoulder, desperately hoping to get help. The police followed this bloody trail to its beginning, and there they found that same yellow rope Daniel had mentioned. The victim really had been tied with it. This confirmed part of his story, but at the same time, completely destroyed the self-defense version. While Lizette was alive, while she was clinging to consciousness in Richard's arms, she managed to tell them something about what she'd been through. And the hardest part, as it turned out, wasn't just the horrific, brutal attack itself, but what happened right after, the search for help. Lying on the cold ground, bleeding out, she quickly saw what looked like rescue, the headlights of an oncoming car. She even tried to wave to somehow get its attention. Unfortunately, they didn't help her. The car drove past. It was only later learned that an elderly woman was driving who just didn't stop. And honestly, it's hard to blame her. Seeing a sight like that at 3 in the morning on a dark highway, that's terrifying. Lizette at that moment desperately hoped that this woman would at least call the police when she got to an area with reception. And as it turned out, this random female driver did exactly that. That was the first call at 3:15. And then, a little later, that same group of workers drove by. The same men, one of whom, Richard, stayed with her, while the other drove on to catch a signal and call for help again. Luckily, Lizette did encounter people who cared, who didn't just drive by, but stopped and tried with all their might to help her. Otherwise, the victim would have just died there, alone, and would never have had time to tell her story or name the names. The news of their daughter's death, of course, was an absolute nightmare for her parents and everyone who knew her. They were endlessly grateful to those random witnesses who didn't drive by, who stopped and spent that last, most difficult time with her. Lizette fought. She fought for over an hour from the moment she was found. And during that time, during that hour of struggle, she managed to repeat her story, to name the names, to several witnesses, and to the medics who arrived and desperately tried to save her life. The fact that she survived the attack at all and held on for so long wasn't just a miracle, it was enormous luck for the investigation. Think about it. Lizette was so mutilated that if she had been found already dead, identifying the body could have taken a very, very long time. She had no documents on her, no cell phone. The criminals made sure of that. Her relatives who lived in another city wouldn't have reported her missing that quickly. Maybe only the next day. All of this, every single factor, could have easily turned this bloody attack into a perfect crime, and the criminals responsible for this atrocity would have just continued to walk free. But unfortunately, although she named them, Lizette physically couldn't provide details in such a critical state. In the last minutes of her life, she couldn't explain who did what, and so it remained unclear what degree of guilt each of these two criminals had. The helicopter rescue operation, as we remember, did happen. The girl was transported to a medical center, but unfortunately, it was already too late. At 4:30 that same morning, she died. The primary cause was massive blood loss. At the time of her death, Lizette Cuesta was only 19 years old. After the arrest, as we already know, Melissa took a position of complete silence. She did not cooperate with the police at all. She gave no answers to any questions. Daniel was also extremely reluctant to talk at first. However, the detectives did manage to crack him, to get him to talk, and the young man gave what they called valuable confessions. What does that mean? It means that even though the police didn't believe his wild story about roleplay and elbow self-defense for a second, he still did the main thing. He agreed that he was the one who inflicted the stab wounds on the girl. He took the knife on himself. Of course, a story like this, a love triangle, a pregnant fiancé, 30 stab wounds, SWAT, all of it generated just colossal, insane interest from the media. Journalists literally swarmed it, bothering not only the grieving families, but also the police themselves. It got absurd. A few particularly persistent reporters even tried to burst into the police station, demanding to be present at the young man's interrogation. Of course, they were categorically denied. But all this commotion sparked even more rumors, even more unwanted attention from outsiders. And all of this, naturally, only further traumatized the heartbroken Cuesta family. The fact that the police had arrested the real criminals was obvious. Lizette herself had pointed them out. But two main unanswered questions remained. First, what role did Melissa really play in this revenge? The same Melissa whom Daniel was so desperately covering for, saying she was just sitting at the wheel? And second, just as important, they had to prove the crime was premeditated, to prove intentional murder. Although, how much more obvious could it be? Detectives reasonably believed that dozens of stab wounds in themselves were more than enough grounds for such assumptions. The investigation was sure that this joyride in the car was no accident. There was a theory that from the very beginning, even as they were getting into the car, the criminals already knew that Lizette would not survive the night. They deliberately lured her to that same deserted place, 50 kilometers from home. And against the backdrop of this logical, cold-blooded version, the young man's whole story about voluntary bondage, roleplay, and sex in the back seat looked, to put it mildly, like complete nonsense. From the very beginning, Daniel desperately tried to blame everything on self-defense or a tragic accident, but he stubbornly, categorically refused to admit that the murder was planned in advance. Instead, the suspect insisted that he just can't properly explain his actions. He described the incident as if, at some point, something just snapped in his head. Just something switched, after which he suddenly, supposedly, completely lost control of himself. Classic defense. Isn't it? It wasn't me. And of course, the show began. Daniel started repeating over and over how much he repented, how he hated himself for this horrific attack. He even said he really wanted to apologize to Lizette's relatives. But you see, he hesitated for a long time because he wasn't sure if the victim's family would want to accept his apology. How noble. Although, as it happened later, he did end up doing it. But for the detectives, it was perfectly obvious that the criminal was simply lying, trying to fake remorse he didn't feel. He just stuck to his latest, absurd version. Meanwhile, Melissa continued to play the silent game and denied any involvement in the attack. It was clear Daniel was lying. He simply refused to answer some key police questions, including the main one. What was the motive, after all? The elbow strike version from a tied-up girl seemed not just implausible, but an outright mockery. There was no way that could have provoked the young man into such wild, uncontrolled aggression. Daniel himself threw out another version. Maybe he lost control that night, from smoking marijuana. Again, a convenient explanation. Trying to understand Daniel's personality, investigators tried to talk to Melissa again, but she still wouldn't cooperate. So they went further. They found the young man's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Jacqueline, and it turned out she had a 1-year-old son with the suspect. She had something interesting to say. According to her, yes, sometimes Daniel did indeed show a very dark and aggressive side of his character. There were moments when he could barely control himself. But despite this, despite knowing about his dark side, even this ex-girlfriend, Jacqueline, had doubts. She doubted he was capable of inflicting 30 stab wounds on a defenseless girl just because of some minor elbow jab. Before this horrific attack, it turned out he had never been involved in violent crimes. The young man had no criminal record. Meanwhile, Daniel himself, in the interrogation room, kept insisting like a broken record that it was self-defense. Of course, that number of blows was, well, let's just say, a little more than necessary to simply stop an attack. His stubbornness only reinforced the total distrust of his every word. Jacqueline, his ex-girlfriend, even appeared in the media. She was in absolute shock, realizing who she had lived with, and that her child had been so close to people capable of such a bloody massacre. And even though her ex-boyfriend had confessed to everything, she expressed an opinion that says a lot. She believed that Daniel, for all his dark side, could not have been the driving force behind this attack. And this idea that Daniel wasn't really this driving force wasn't just shared by his ex-girlfriend Jacqueline. As it turned out, she knew Melissa well, and she, not mincing words, considered her a cunning, toxic manipulator. In Jacqueline's opinion, Melissa had simply taken Daniel under complete, total control, like a puppet in a theater. And it was she, this puppet master, who brought these absurd, explosive polyamorous relationships to their logical, bloody conclusion. Even if the knife was physically in Daniel's hand, there was just too much weirdness in this story. Too many questions aimed right at Melissa. Why was she the one driving? Why was she, a pregnant woman, driving down this completely deserted road at 3 a.m, into such impenetrable wilderness? And most importantly, the question with no logical answer. Why? Why didn't she go to the police after her fiancé, right behind her, right before her eyes, murdered a girl? Why didn't she call 911 after seeing 30 stab wounds? Instead, she just calmly drove home, covering 50 kilometers, and went to bed in her pajamas like nothing happened. Seriously, from the outside, it seemed like it didn't bother her one bit. She treated this savage butchery as something completely mundane, like some minor inconvenience that happened on the way home. And to this chorus of voices pointing fingers at Melissa, of course, the young man's mother, Daniel's mother, also joined in. She immediately took a very clear stance. She declared that she wasn't going to make excuses for her son if he really turned out to be the criminal. That's a strong statement. However, there's always that however. She, just like the ex-girlfriend Jacqueline, was convinced that Daniel, given his character, simply could not have been the driving force of this crime. Such wild, inhuman cruelty, 30 knife blows, was completely out of character for him, in her opinion. And the woman proposed her own theory. A pretty wild one, honestly, but it perfectly shows how strongly the mother disbelieved in her son's independent guilt. She believed Melissa might have used something to incite him, to completely cloud his consciousness. She even suggested that maybe Melissa slipped something into his drink, literally poisoned his mind, and he, as if driven mad, just started mechanically following her orders. It sounds like some medieval witch hunt, of course, but Daniel's mother also recounted more down-to-earth, disturbing facts. A few days before the murder, she personally noticed very suspicious behavior from Melissa. The girl was literally furious. She incessantly brought up Lizette, spoke about her in extremely negative terms, and as the mother claimed, Melissa even said she wanted Lizette dead. And what's most interesting, at this same time, Daniel, on the contrary, was completely calm and was even trying to calm down his pregnant fiancée. The woman had seen with her own eyes how quickly this future daughter-in-law took complete, total control over all areas of her son's life. The young man, before her eyes, became a simple object of manipulation. In just a few months of their relationship, Melissa was already tracking his every move. This manipulative behavior, by the way, even caused serious tension between the young people and the mother herself. Detectives, of course, first checked what they always check: the suspect's cell phones and computers. They were looking for a plan, looking for threats, looking for Google searches like how to get rid of a body or deserted roads near Tracy. But here, they couldn't find any valuable information. Empty. This, by the way, suggests that the criminals were probably smart enough to use simple verbal communication to discuss the details of the future murder. They left no digital trail of conspiracy, but they forgot about another trail. Checking the geolocation data from their phones, investigators noticed one very interesting detail. Yes, the group really did drive around the city that evening, just as Daniel said, just driving around. But right after midnight, their phones suddenly ping far off their usual route. They detoured, and this trip out of town, to that same deserted Whirl Hollow Road at 1 a.m. It seemed completely inappropriate, illogical, and atypical to the investigators. This wasn't just driving around. This looked like a purposeful drive to a crime scene, and the investigation decided to use this as another powerful piece of circumstantial evidence of premeditation. So what do we have? The investigation had pretty strong evidence against this pair. The most important, of course, was Lizette's own story, told in the last minutes of her life to several witnesses. In jurisprudence, this is called a dying declaration, and it carries enormous weight. But there was a technical problem. Law enforcement couldn't record it on audio or video. She was dying in their arms, so it was only the oral testimony of witnesses, which, theoretically, could be easily challenged in court by the defense as hearsay, even considering the fact that different people, both the worker Richard and the paramedics, told the exact same story. Unfortunately, for 100% ironclad, irrefutable proof, this wasn't enough. They needed to confirm the deceased's words about the attack by Daniel and Melissa with something physical, and the investigators went to the house where this couple of killers lived, with a search warrant. And right there, they found what they needed. They found a whole range of evidence that linked them not only to the victim, but directly to the crime scene. Specifically, that same yellow rope Daniel mentioned. They found an identical spool of this rope in their garage, as well as another piece in the car the couple used. And most importantly, a piece of this very same rope was found at the crime scene, at the very beginning of that 100-meter bloody trail left by the victim. This was a direct physical link, and the car itself, the vehicle where this whole massacre took place, they didn't even clean it. It wasn't cleaned of blood. The interior was soaked in blood. And forensics, of course, confirmed that all this blood belonged to Lizette Cuesta. So charges could be filed, but, and here's the main problem for the prosecution, so far the ironclad direct charges were only against Daniel. The knife, the same knife used to stab the girl to death, was found, and on the handle were only the fingerprints of the young man, Daniel's. Melissa was clean. She only left her prints on the steering wheel, meaning, from the perspective of dry physical evidence, she had no direct connection to the execution itself. He cut, she drove. However, morally, ethically, and just humanly, everything, absolutely everything indicated that she was that puppet master, that it was she, out of jealousy, who pushed her lover to this crime and cold-bloodedly controlled everything that happened while sitting at the wheel. And so we're in the courtroom. Picture this scene: the families of the defendants, Daniel and Melissa, and the family of the murdered Lizette. They're sitting on different sides, but in the tight courtroom, the distance between them was very small. They were literally breathing the same air. The atmosphere from the very first second wasn't just tense, it was electrified. It was ringing with hatred. It felt like it was about to explode. Everyone was waiting for that explosion. And, of course, it happened. It was simply inevitable. As soon as Daniel was brought into the room, one of the deceased Lizette's relatives just couldn't take it. He stood up and started screaming right at him, at this killer. The man was ready, it seemed, to tear him to pieces with his bare hands. In very harsh, unflattering terms, he declared that these subhumans didn't stand a chance against them. It seemed like this verbal displeasure was about to escalate into something much more, into a physical brawl, right in the courtroom. But the bailiffs and other relatives still managed to somehow restrain this man. And just as this tension reached its absolute peak, when everyone was already braced for the start of a long, dirty legal battle, the completely unexpected happened. Daniel's lawyers stood up and he shocked absolutely everyone in the room. He calmly announced that his client, Daniel Gross, intended to confess completely to first-degree murder with the use of a deadly weapon, to inflicting great bodily injury, and all of it with aggravating circumstances. The courtroom fell silent.
Daniel has been absolutely committed to accepting responsibility for his friend's death. And he proved that when he confessed to the police at the very outset, and he has proven it today by entering his guilty plea to these charges.
This confession, it covered absolutely all the charges that had been filed against the defendant, against Daniel. No buts or I didn't do that. A complete, total confession. And of course, the first thing the defense did right after that explosion in the courtroom, they immediately asked to bar the media representatives. The journalists were asked to leave, at least for the time being, while they discussed this new reality. I mean, they obviously needed time to digest all of it without dozens of cameras pointed in their faces. However, as it turned out, there wasn't really much left to discuss. Everything ended surprisingly quickly. Soon the hearing resumed, and the media, who were literally boiling with impatience in the hallway, were eventually allowed to come back in and witness the finale of this high-profile process. This statement from the killer, this sudden, full confession, was simultaneously a huge shock and, to be honest, an incredible relief, especially, of course, for Lizette's family. I mean, they were already mentally preparing for a completely different scenario. They were bracing for a long, dirty, drawn-out legal battle, thinking they'd have to listen to disgusting details of what happened for months, if not years, and fight for every single scrap in court. And then, just like that, it was over. However, small but very important legal questions did remain. Yes, Daniel had admitted his guilt in the murder, but he hadn't yet specified the degree of that murder. And that, in the American justice system, that's a key moment. It probably meant they'd need to hold a separate, much shorter hearing where this crucial criterion, first or second degree, would be finalized. I mean, the difference is colossal, especially in the sentencing. According to California state law, the penalty for second-degree murder was 16 years to life, but for first-degree murder, it was 26 years to life. And right here, another completely unexpected move happens, Daniel. This young man pleaded guilty, and he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He didn't take some secret plea deal with the prosecution in exchange for something, no, but he justified this decision. Supposedly, He wanted to somehow soften the horrific blow for Lizette's family. You know, that logic. He decided that this way they could all avoid that long, exhausting, traumatic trial that would just reopen their wounds over and over again. From the outside, of course, it might have seemed like the guy had truly, sincerely repented. What a shame, right? Except for all these high emotions and all this performative remorse, it was already kind of way too late. So what about Melissa? What about our Just the Driver? Melissa also, of course, remained under arrest. And her prospects? The prospects of a pregnant woman being accused of complicity in such a savage murder? They obviously really scared her. It seemed like this girl was so far removed from the criminal world, especially given her, as they say, delicate condition. She stubbornly, categorically continued to deny any involvement in the planning, in organizing the conspiracy. In any of it, she was just sitting at the wheel. But there was one ironclad, undeniable fact against her. The victim, as she was dying, named two names. She named Daniel and Melissa. And so in the eyes of the investigation, she was also an active participant in the attack. However, because of her pregnancy and her complete refusal to cooperate, the process against her dragged on. Her lawyer started playing the obvious card. He started pushing for pity. He insisted on his client's release, citing first and foremost her pregnancy. He argued that the colossal stress she was experiencing in jail could easily lead to a miscarriage. And you know what? Eventually, it worked. She was released. She was sent to house arrest for the time being. While preparations for her separate trial continued, but house arrest isn't free. The investigation into her role continued, and it dragged on for a long time, a very long time. A full 5 years passed, 5 years of legal wrangling, and then, finally, a 30-year-old, not 25-year-old anymore, Melissa Leonardo found herself in the defendant's chair. And yes, she was found guilty. Meanwhile, Daniel's lawyer, for the same Daniel who by this time had turned 24 in prison, hadn't been sitting idle this whole time. He was fighting to soften the sentence, to get a review of the case for this young man who had so sincerely repented. And the defense attorney, strangely enough, managed to make some progress. How they started actively pushing a new convenient version. Now this horrific knife attack, these 30 blows, were being explained as a sudden mental illness, an illness that supposedly causes Daniel to have strong, uncontrollable hallucinations. And who was blamed for provoking these hallucinations? Take 3 guesses. Of course, Melissa. Meanwhile, in court, Melissa was finally officially recognized as the very person everyone had considered her from the start, the sole mastermind behind this brutal massacre. According to Daniel's defense, which obviously was now very convenient for the prosecution as well, this girl deliberately used illegal substances to provoke the appearance of those same hallucinations in her mentally unstable boyfriend. I mean, we're right back to what Daniel's mother said from the very beginning. They were proving that Melissa knew about his mental health problems and just cold-bloodedly exploited that instability by pumping him full of drugs. As they claimed, Melissa was easily able to push this young man into the bloody massacre of Lizette. And here it is, the finale of this drama. Both of them, the executor and the mastermind, were sentenced to 15 years in prison. Daniel, to be fair, as an aggravating circumstance, was additionally given a special enhancement for the direct use of the knife, which slightly increased his actual term, 15 years. For 30 stab wounds and a planned murder, Lizette's relatives, to put it mildly, were not exactly satisfied with what seemed to them an incredibly lenient sentence, and you can absolutely understand why. Besides, no verdict, no amount of prison time, none of it was ever going to bring back the wonderful, bright person they lost that night. However, they still believed that in some, albeit incomplete sense, justice had prevailed. At least Melissa, that same puppet master, that same clean driver, also got what she unquestionably deserved. Neither of them managed to escape justice, and all of this is exclusively thanks to one person. Thanks to that same brave 19-year-old girl who fought until her absolute last breath, and who, as she was dying, managed to name the names and help solve her own horrific murder. And if you sum up this whole wild, dark, tragic story, you can really only say one thing: the human psyche, human jealousy, and complicated relationships. This is definitely not a field for irresponsible, stupid experiments. Thank you so much for watching. This story is a horrific reminder that jealousy and manipulation, especially when mixed with instability, isn't just drama. It's a recipe for absolute disaster. I have to ask you, what shocked you more? The fact that Daniel delivered 30 stab wounds, or the fact that Melissa sat calmly in the driver's seat while it happened? And tell us honestly, do you think 15 years for her, the mastermind, is justice at all? May Lizette Cuesta rest in peace. Her strength in those final moments was truly incredible. Also, please check out the next videos you see on the screen right now.